Hello, friends. Welcome to today's daily devotion. I'm Kerry Wood, pastor of the Goldston Methodist Church in Goldston, North Carolina, and we're continuing to go through the Apostle Paul's letter to the church in Colossae. We call this Colossians, and we're in chapter 3, and we're dealing with what can be considered a very practical expression of how we live out our faith in Christ, but it's also very controversial, as yesterday's passage talked about, as husbands and wives. Well, today we turn our attention to another core part of the family, the children, in Colossians 3, verses 20 and 21. Hear now these words. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. So, where do you think our emphasis ought to be in these two verses? Is the emphasis on the kids, or is the emphasis on the parents, specifically the dads? Well, it was commonly understood in Paul's day what verse 20 says, children, obey your parents in everything. This was a common cultural expectation in every culture of the first century. Whether you were Roman, Greek, Jewish, African, it didn't matter. Kids were supposed to obey, especially Dad. When Dad's word came down, the kids were expected to follow it faithfully, immediately, no arguing. Yeah, it was just as hard back then as it is today. Kids have a natural state of rebelliousness, and it makes them hard to actually obey at times. We all know it, and so that's why Paul gives us this encouragement. The kids are to obey their parents, but Paul puts it into the context not of culture, but of theology. This pleases the Lord. This is something we do not for our own sake, but for our sake in Christ. God is the one that wants us to understand obedience, because as we are able to deal with this in the human perspective, that helps us to see it in the divine perspective, which is why I personally think the emphasis is not on the children's part, but on the dads. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. One of the things that I've come to learn of my season of being a parent and now a grandparent is that I have a tremendous impact on how my children's and grandchildren's personalities are formed. If I'm harsh, they will learn harshness. If I am mean, they will learn meanness. If I am impatient, they will learn impatience. If I am angry, they will learn, you guessed it, anger. So I have to be so aware of how I present myself to my children, to my grandchildren, to my nieces, to my nephews, to the kids here in my church that I'm not directly related to, but I'm the pastor, and therefore I have an influence. I must be on my best behaviors. Remember what Paul told us about what our clothing is supposed to be? Well, I have to wear that all the time so that I become not a discourager, but an encourager, not creating bitterness, but creating sweetness and life. I can't do this in my own strength. I must do it in and through Jesus. That's why Paul gives us so much about what our appropriate way of life is before we ever get to these practical things like parenting and marriage. If we don't get it right with God first, we'll never get it right with each other. So how are you doing in this field? What are the ways in which you can give some encouragement to the rest of us about how to be better parents, how to be better children? Because I am still a child to my dad, even though I'm in my late 50s and he's in his late 70s. Yeah, we're still expected to obey our parents, for this pleases the Lord. So how are you doing? What can you do better? What have you already shown is a great way to live this out. And I'll see you tomorrow for our next daily devotion.